Now I have it on. We will start now for C# stuff. Remember, if you have questions, feel free to tag me in the Hello KC channel so I notice it and help. Also, feel free to shout out any questions. I'll try to understand what it is you're saying. Let me know if I'm not loud enough or if my code zoom in is not large enough. Ooh, model bindings and Bootstrap, that's exciting. There's the word I'm looking for. Oh, that's not the right word. Theme. You didn't remind me that it's difficult to read dark backgrounds whenever you're trying to read from far away. All right, so model binding did appear to be an area of some confusion, of which I will cover as we go over Yes, I am unmuted. First time I've remembered to do that. And I remember to click start broadcast, so everyone should be rather proud. I was able to get through that after 4.5 months of class. All right, so my plan for this evening, I'll cover binding. Bootstrap won't get covered unless we have time, unfortunately. The order will be, I'm going to cover cheese MVC and a little bit around adding the edit functionality so that you can edit cheeses, which was one of the pre-work recommendations to try that out. I purposely changed some things around how the cheese model is represented and how cheese data is represented to be more realistic to a software system you would create. So I'm going to be using the GUID again. And because I used that, it actually caused some annoyance for me with the way that default MVC works. So you'll get to see what I did to sort of get around that, which is also something you'll often do as you start to write code and the framework you're using doesn't quite do what you want. So I'll show you that as well. It's related to how the routing works. And then finally, I will cover a solution to the studio that I'm actually going to write the code for you all in front of you so that you can see me writing and building it out, because there isn't very much classes that are needed. I haven't been doing that as much lately because a lot of I needed more code quickly and didn't have enough time. I believe there will be enough time for me to cover the studio solution while typing it up. Hopefully, I am not wrong. And as a reminder of what cheese MVC does, we'll go into it. We'll start it up. I am unmuted. Oh, wait, that was my watch. There we go. All right. So after a couple years, the framework starts up and you can see it. So we need to add some cheeses first because we still don't actually have a persistent data store. So we can say cheese 1. And then we have cheese 2. These are my really creative cheese names. We add that cheese. So if you notice, there's now a little edit icon. So it's another example of where I'm using that glyphicon area of Bootstrap So go to getbootstrap.com/CSS, go to components. The first thing on this page is a whole bunch of icons. And this one right here is what I'm using. Put glyphicon-pencil as your class on a little span tag. You'll get that super fancy pencil that everyone just knows means you're going to edit it. You'll notice something a little bit different here. My ID is not an integer. I'm using the GUID because that is a better practice in a software system than just using an ID. It allows for a lot better flexibility as your software grows. So for instance, something that is very common at a company is they might start in the US, they might start in Europe. So they'll have their database, it'll be going along, churning out new users, may put new data in there, always using an integer that auto increments. There are legal restrictions on where you can store your data. So then you have to start a new database in another physical location. And then you end up with IDs that collide between the two databases because that new database starts over at 1 and would collide with your other user. So if you start off by using globally unique IDs, the odds of collision are a lot less across all of your software systems. So it's a good idea to keep that in mind when you do go to build something. That's why I keep insisting on using them. They're very ugly to read, but fortunately, your users never need to read them. As long as you give them a nice name, they can Cheese1 is a great name for cheese. They can read it. So now we can go here. We can rename this cheese. We'll call it cheddar, and it's yellow and tasty. Note I didn't update the button name for some reason. That button should definitely say save cheese. And if you notice, the order stayed the same, which is important when you update data. Unless you're sorting by updated date, you should be sure your users see data in the same order each time they come back. Otherwise, it can be very confusing. Unless there's a clear, obvious reason you're sorting and it's indicated in your UI. Otherwise, unfortunate for your users. And initially, I didn't have it working correctly. I added 4 cheeses, and then I changed one that went to the bottom, and I couldn't find it. And realized I was not maintaining the sort. The code that achieves it is done through the controller. So we have our cheese controller. We have the cheese models from the prep work. Then we have our view. So our edit view, I'll show the view first because it is the sort of exactly what you would probably expect. So we use the view bag, we have a cheese, show its name, a view bag of cheese, and we show a cheese ID. For fun, what I am going to show you, because this wasted a good deal of my time. You notice I just changed that cheese ID to a lowercase c. So now if I come on over here, we refresh, we're fine. We come in here, an error happens. That's super helpful. What was confusing for me is the error message here. It is saying it does not have a definition for cheese ID. But what's not obvious is where that exception came from. At least to me, I was unable to tell that that came from the template. Having poorly named it, we're really mistyping it. And at the same time, I was messing with parameter names in the route. So I didn't realize between the two which one I'd messed up. The thing that sort of tipped me off is this kept showing compiler services. And I finally saw this razor view buried inside the stack trace. So if the very first message of what you have doesn't quite get you what you're needing, if you read a little further in your stack trace, you start to see, oh, razor view. Let me go check to see, make sure my view file's okay. That's actually what happens. And it goes back to working. I wanted to show that just as an example of, as you start to see errors, it may not be obvious up front what the problem is. And it took me a lot longer than it probably should have to figure out why that error was occurring. As for this edit template, we have a form. It default posts, so the action's not defined, so it's going to default post to the current URL. And then these form groups here are what cause the label and input. I'm gonna swap the order of these guys. Cause them to display stacked on top of each other in that manner. You get that from Bootstrap. So that's why the form group is there. And then the form control is another class within Bootstrap that gives it nicer styling. That's why it has sort of the rounded edges with that little gray, and when you click on it, it gets the nice drop shadow highlight in the background. And then finally, we default the value to the current cheese's name for this name label. Notice that the ID and name that we have given it is name, which matches the cheese model. So just so that's clear, we can look at that cheese model that we have. We have a name, we have a description, and that is what you see here. Now, if you notice, there is no cheese ID in my form. The reason this works is if you come over here, if you look up at the URL, you'll see that it's cheese, edit, and then the ID of the cheese. So it's more common on websites when you go to what's called a detail view. If you wanted to Google around it, it's commonly referred to as a detail view. For updates to whatever you're looking at, so in this case our cheese, to be posted back to the URL with the ID in it. And the reason the ID is there is so there's no accidental possibility that you update the wrong cheese. So if you're depending on it being something sent in the form body, the ID, there's a larger opportunity for defects, problems in your code over time. The other reason this pattern is sort of common is usually what you would do is you go to the detail page, you would see a representation of the cheese, which maybe we might show some yellow because we see the word yellow in the description, and it wouldn't be editable. And then the user clicks edit, the page becomes editable, they change it and they click save, all while staying on that same page. So it's one of the reasons it's very common to submit that update to the same URL that has your ID in the URL. And other websites do this quite a bit. Trello, if you've ever used that, does it for everything. There's extra stuff on the end of your URL that actually isn't used. The ID is what determines what gets updated. And we know by looking at our form, it's submitting to that same URL each time we go and make an update. And we have an input submit, it says add cheese. Really, that should be update cheese. We can refresh this, and it says update cheese. Now, to look back at the cheese class, what I've changed from what was suggested is this is no longer an integer. It is a string that when the cheese is created. I did that on other classes. I forgot to do it here. The ID of the cheese shouldn't be updatable once you create a cheese that has an ID forever. So setting it should be private to the class. So here, we instantiate a new cheese. So we get cheese equals, we generate a new globally unique identifier. We do toString, so we actually get the string representation. And then we have to go and replace every hyphen with an empty string because the MVC framework absolutely does not allow hyphens in your variables, in your URL. So I'll show you in a second where that's used in the controller. But the main piece, if you notice the URL here, it's just a big long string of numbers and letters. Unless you write your own what's called route binding, you can't have hyphens in the variable that's resolved from the route. So inside the route, this value is called cheese ID, as you might expect, because it's what allows us to go and update the cheese later. The value can't have hyphens, which is why when I go and create a cheese, I remove the hyphens. And I actually thought this was kind of interesting. Rather than use a string that has no value in it, in C#, you have to use string.empty. It complains quite a bit and won't compile if you attempt to just use an empty string. That was a nice surprise for me. So another bonus that you just learned, because I don't like using regular IDs, I never would have found that out. And then something else that I did here was override equals. The reason I am doing this is to ensure, actually, that when we update the cheese, it keeps it in the right order. I'll show you why I needed to do that in a second. But all I'm doing here in equals, this object equal null or get type not equal to the same type. This is stolen implementation directly from the base object. So if you recall, I showed you the object source code on Monday. These first 4 lines are the first 4 lines of that function, method, of that method. Now what's different and something you haven't seen much of here is I'm doing what's called typecasting. So we allow any object to be passed in. And so in that case, all that C# knows about the object at that point, the only thing you can do with the obj parameter there is all of the things that are defined on object. So the only thing I can call is equals, get hash code, get type, and toString. The only available methods, which doesn't help me for determining if 2 cheeses are equal. I need to be able to compare 2 cheeses. So I do what's called typecasting on line 30. And the reason it's safe to do the typecasting, so you should not do typecasting willy-nilly, because you can cause runtime exceptions. If you attempt to cast, for instance, a student to a cheese, your program will crash immediately and not be great for your users. The reason it is safe to do that typecasting, specifically this get type right here on this slide that says get type, which calls the get type method of your cheese. So you inherit that automatically from object, and then it calls our passed in parameters object.getType. If they're not equal, we immediately say the 2 objects aren't equal because you must have the same type in order to be equal. So at this point, we know they're the same type, so we can safely do the type assertion. So right here, this parenthesis type that I want it to be in the variable, and the assignment, specifically stating I am having a cheese for passed cheese. I call it passed cheese because that's the object that is passed in. which now if we go and do hash cheese, we can now see the other methods we can call. We now see our cheese ID, property, our description, our name. We see we actually have all those attributes available to us because we have done the type conversion on line 30. So now what we've done here is use the equals of cheese ID. Cheese ID is a string, so we check to see if our current cheese ID is equal to the past cheese ID. We just return that result. That's how we determine if two cheeses are equal. So those are the changes to the cheese class, and those were necessary because I wanted to use the string for an ID rather than an integer. Cheese data is exactly as it was before. We have all of our cheeses. We get our cheese by ID. It's a string now instead of an integer. Same lambda function here using the link syntax to go and get a cheese. Then I'll show you what save does in a moment. That's where I made it behave more like an object relational mapper, like what we'll be using later. So the bulk of what edit goes and does is in here in our controller. So we have our cheese controller, which shows us our list of cheeses. We can add a cheese still. As we demonstrated, we can edit our cheeses. So we have our index, shows a list of cheeses. Add still there. Cheese add, HTTP post for the new cheese, same as what was there. Now when we get into, we have our two edit methods here on our class. The first one is the HTTP get. That is what is displayed when we go to the route cheese edit cheese ID. And that cheese ID right here corresponds directly to both the cheese ID parameter we have there, as well as the cheese object's cheese ID. If you attempt to change these values, you will break it. If you attempt to change those variable names, because the framework makes assumptions on the convention. So before, one of the previous sets of class, we talked about convention over configuration. The model we are using to sort of back this route is the cheese model. And it has a property called cheese ID. So within our controller code, anytime we're actually wanting to do something that relates to that cheese ID property, we need to make sure we use the exact same variable name. So the .NET Core MVC framework does a lot of what's called reflection under the covers for you, and it goes and determines the name of the variable that you're using and compares that to what is available on your model class. So because we're using a cheese controller explicitly, we have a controller called cheese controller inside of our controller directory. And we have a models directory that has a cheese file and class in it. The framework automatically goes and associates your controller and the lookups it does for parameters to your models. It does a whole lot of work under the covers for you, so you do not have to. And that's one of the big advantages to the idea of convention over configuration. Now, sort of as I have done here, I've overridden some of the convention because part of its convention is out of the box. It assumes you use integers or your IDs. And if you change them from integers, the way that it parses the URL and automatically resolves stuff stops working. That's why I had to override the route. So previously, so if you look at the example and the prep work, did not need to override run. It automatically do cheese edit, cheese ID, you could automatically get it, it would work, show you what is expected. That stops working whenever you do modify some of the defaults. So I modified what is an expected default, the ID of a model, from being an integer to being a string. So then I needed to handle that a little better with the code that I wrote, which is why I've overridden the URL. And in this case, we get the cheese ID from the URL defined here in the actual URL, this big long string. And you can see it below here. If you're super curious, that's fine. I believe this works. What that value is. So something I have not shown you very much. I finally figured out how to use the debugger in a reliable way. So we can come over here. So I'll throw the debugger in here so we can see the values. In your .NET, you automatically, not .NET, well, yes, you're writing .NET. In Visual Studio, the debugger automatically starts running if you're on your Mac. The easiest way that I've actually found out is to use that default attached process. Somehow it magically just monitors all the processes and knows which one. So now if I go to edit, it goes and shoots me over here automatically. And we can go and see that the cheese ID that's passed in, we don't modify it, we can see all of those values automatically. So whereas in Python it was really easy to put print statements and see what you have, what I have found is in C#, it is much easier if you can just throw a breakpoint in what you're wanting to see. Because you can go further in sort of any of these, you can do, you can evaluate which direction, yes. So then you can evaluate what you're getting immediately in your console. In Visual Studio, it ends up popping up in a panel, it's like right here, bottom, when you go to write stuff. But I actually used this debugger when I was trying to figure out why my cheese ID wasn't getting passed. So for a while, before I went and removed the hyphens from my ID, it wasn't showing me any of what I had. So I could see that cheese ID wasn't getting filled out. That's something that can be very helpful as you're writing the code to be able to tell, oh, I don't have a value because I'm not correctly filling it out. So in my case, it was because you can't have hyphens inside of route parameters by default. So that's how the edit works. We get the cheese. We use get by ID, which works. I'm actually going to take advantage of the peak from now on. Does exactly what the other one did. Cheeses.single. Cheeses is a list of cheese objects. Goes and grabs one. If they're equal, and it goes and returns it. Otherwise, it does not. What I was actually getting was a runtime exception, because if you attempt to use this link syntax and you don't have a result in your data set, we'll raise a runtime error and crash your program if you're not handling it. So for fun, if we come over here and I remove that, we go and restart. So we've restarted. You can go to home. You can add cheeses. Keep adding more cheeses. This will work. It ends up breaking now. So we go to edit. I fixed it. Yes, when we go to save it, it breaks. And that's because, you know, you'll read in here, it says sequence contains no matching element. Invalid ID operation exception. And that is because the hyphens cause an issue with the way that .NET is automatically parsing our URLs. Which I updated the code to not do that. And the actual saving of our cheese is fairly simple. We actually go and we get a cheese ID, the URL that it hits, and we automatically add the cheese object. So this is an example of the binding that had been mentioned, so the data binding that occurs. The data binding is automatic because we have the attributes we need to create a cheese object. So we have our ID, we have the name, and we have the description. And that's all because we have the description and name in the form that we're submitting, and the URL contains the ID of our cheese. Now what's different about what I have done here is I'm calling a static method on cheese data that is called save. The reason that I made it a static method is to follow the convention that was already in the class, which is every member of that class, so all the methods are static methods. So if we go over to our cheese data, we have a static, static, another static, another static, some more statics, all static methods. And that's because right now we're using that cheese data file as kind of our database. So it needs to sort of be global and only have one instance of all of our data. In this case, it doesn't really have an instance, it just has a class definition that contains all of our cheeses. Making an instance of cheese data is worthless because there are no instance variables. They're all class level variables. So what the save goes and does, we go to our cheeses, we go and call index of. Now index of is why I had to override the equals method on cheese. Previous to overriding it, there was no, it never found the right cheese because the default comparison in C# for equals and equal between two objects is to see if they are literally the same object in memory. And whenever we go and create two instances of cheese, they're not the same object in memory, it kept returning false. And so this value ended up being negative. And then I tried to insert a negative value and it broke every time. So what this goes and does is it gets the index of where our cheese was, goes and removes that cheese. So I won't show what removes does, I'll show that in a minute. goes and removes the cheese from all of our cheeses. And then finally, and this is what keeps the order, we go and reinsert our updated cheese. And the reason for that is because each time you go into your cheese controller and you have this edit action and you post, it's creating a new instance of that cheese object. It has no idea that there are already cheeses anywhere in your system. So when you go and make that post, it's going and actually creating, when it does the binding, this goes and creates a new cheese instance that will have the same ID as your previous cheese, because that's how you've defined it in what you are creating. And because it goes and creates a new instance of it, that's why a separate save is necessary. So when you do that data binding, you can either do what the example did, which is cheese data dot get by ID, and then we could do cheese dot cheese ID. All this existing cheese equals that, and then we could go and manually update it like this. And then do our redirect. And that will work exactly as we expect. It will do the same behavior. The reason I did not do that is as you start to work in using actual models that are backed by a database, this type of syntax is more of what you will do. An object.save, object.update. You won't go and update it as it already exists because you won't be, that cheese won't just be sitting there in memory inside of your list of cheeses. So the reason that the implementation and the prep work works is because we have a private list of cheeses that we're just keeping track of. That's always there in memory. But in a real running system, you don't keep all of your cheeses in memory. They're off usually in some other server somewhere else inside of a database, especially if you're building web applications. So what that means is right here in the controller, when you automatically get a cheese, what you would normally do is just call cheese.save. That would do the work of persisting it to your database. So in our case, what cheesedata.save does is it goes and persists it back to the index. The underlying implementation here that I've done is less important. What I wanted to show is the reason I went through some of this lower level complexity on how to save it back to the array that we have is once you start to use models, you won't automatically already have your cheese available to do things with. So you'll actually need to go set values on your cheese and save your cheese. Sort of to cover this, in case you were curious, remove. All remove does is take the cheese ID, gets a cheese, and then calls the remove that you get on every list. In C# has a remove, will remove the object from the list for you. So it's a nice benefit. Are there any questions on this before we move on over to the studio? Answer.
So if somebody just puts in a random cheese ID into the URL, does your save method check for the see that it's a database first? or will it just spit out an error like it did?
Yes, it will just error. So here, so there are no cheeses. As you would expect, if I just go to this URL randomly, it goes and throws an error because what it tries to do under the covers is find the cheese in your list of cheeses, and it breaks because there are no cheeses yet. So this is breaking for the same reason it broke in other cases, in that the underlying cheese list has no cheeses or doesn't have a cheese with the ID that you specify. And this will actually be, this sort of error of going to a URL and the underlying object that you're trying to get to doesn't exist, will be handled for you when you start using actual MVC models, because it will raise a very specific exception that the framework itself handles and will return. It's called a 404, not found error. So you'll hit the URL, you'll get a nice 404 page if you've configured one, or default 404 page. They'll just say, oh, your model's not here. But in our case, our list has nothing in it. It attempted to get a value out of it. And what C# does by default, when you're using the link syntax and you attempt to grab a value, it assumes you will have a matching element. And if you do not, you must handle that exception. We haven't talked much about exception handling, but you would need to handle that exception inside of our cheese data right here where we do get by ID. So same as Python, you have a try statement. And then in our case, we'll see what happens. But you return a new cheese, or in a different case, you might do something else. So this would be an empty cheese, because the cheese doesn't have anything in it. This, you would need to do a try catch. What you would likely want to catch here is a specific exception, but I need to Google that syntax. We'll not do right now. But that try catch is how you would handle the exceptions that get raised automatically by calling various methods and functions. Any questions? Any more questions, I should say? All right, we'll come over here, stop this. We're in our code directory. We need to make a new directory. So this will be a solution to the studio for the quizzes. So we will call this quiz. That's not how you spell quiz. That's how you spell quiz. We'll make a directory quiz. We'll go inside quiz. We'll go and create a new project, which is a console application. Actually reopen another code window in hopes that it figures out. There we go. Yay. But we know, if you recall from the studio, we have 3 types of quiz questions we want to be able to answer, which I sort of dubbed radio choice, multi-choice, and true-false. Radio choice, which relates very heavily to web features of radio buttons, are they can only choose one and only one answer. The next one being true-false. The answer is either true or false, as you might expect. And finally, you have the multiple choice, which allows the user to select n number of possible answers of the one you gave. So what that likely means is So we've created our quiz class, which in this case, we're going to make a base class so that all of our other quizzes can inherit it. So we have behavior we will expect of each one of our quiz objects. Okay, there we go. You might be asking why I've made this an abstract class. The reason I've made it an abstract class is quiz itself, you can't really have, well, actually, I'm going to call this quiz question. You can't really have a generic quiz question. You're always going to need some kind of concrete example of a quiz question. Things that we will need for our quiz questions, before we worry about types, I'll just sort of stub it out here. We know that we will want some kind of, we'll just call it question. There's a word I'm trying to think, interrogative, imperative. There's types of sentences. We could use that word. I can't remember what it is right now. So let's call it a question. We know for any sort of given quiz, we need to have a way to we'll have a question, and we need a way to validate said question. So validate the answer. Whatever answer they gave us, we need to be able to validate it. We'll call it valid answer. So question, this one will be somewhat straightforward. We can make this a public abstract string. Call question. That's right. What this says is all of our subclasses are going to have a question method that will return a string, and what we're assuming that will be is a question. Now valid answer, we'll make that public abstract as well. It will be a Boolean. And it needs to return whether or not the answer given is a valid answer. So if we think about the three types of questions we have a radio choice. Only one of the possible questions is able to be answered. True, false, which is going to be true or false. So in both those cases, we know there's really only one input the user could give. However, our last option, which is the multiple choice, so multi-choice, they can give a lot of answers. So you might be tempted, when you think about the first two, of creating some kind of attribute on here that would be an answer that your subclasses would always have. They would have some kind of answer that would be a string. But what is somewhat confusing here is you don't actually know what answer or answers are possible. But as you start to think about that, you know, well, they're going to have an answer. And we can probably assume an answer is a string. I'm going to rename this. This is where, when you're in Visual Studio, it's really nice because you can click rename, it'll rename all your stuff when you use the refactor command. So as you probably realized, I'm going to create a quiz answer class. Every quiz will have some kind of answer. So in this case, down here, now we'll have a public class, quiz answer, which initially for right now is just going to have one public value, which is a string. I'll call it answer. Of a get and a set. Then up above, in order to make this less angry, we need to use the using system.collection.generic. And then need to properly, oh, that's right, that's what I'm mad about. I don't believe it. Yeah, you can ignore that. That is the editor being messed up. As you've seen many times, even Visual Studio gets confused. It's because I renamed it and renamed the file. I think if I reopen it, it'll actually be. Oh. Oh well. Program ran happily, so that means it built. It's not a problem. So the next thing that we need is what we'll call a I'm going to be lazy here. We're going to define them all in our quiz question file. We'll call this radio question. And it will implement quiz question. No. So you'll notice immediately it complains that this class does not implement the two abstract methods. So that'll be the first thing we need to do is we will have a public abstract public string question. In our case, there we go. We want them to be so here when we go and define our radio question, we're going to say that it requires a question. You define it. So in this case, then we go and set our question equal to question. Oh, it's all confused. So then we're going to go and write this. For each one of these, we'll go and define our constructors for each one of our classes. I don't have enough time to finish now that I look at my watch. Unfortunately, I will show an answer. I'll post it in Slack by the end of the evening. The main path forward that we are going to go with, unless you despise it, in which case we won't, is so we have this public list of answers. And then we have an abstract question, an abstract valid answer. What we're likely going to want to do is something more where you list, you allow the person to say which answers they've given and the answers that are actually correct. So really, change we need here. So question's still fine because we're going to need to be able to return a question. To take a list of quiz answer as it suggests. What doesn't it like? I'll figure out the, oh, right. Oh, what it wants? Yeah. There we go. We'll have the answers on each one of our quiz questions. We put them in there. And if they're valid answers, you can go and know whether or not they're valid. And you can determine that in your own individual implementation. The reason for having your own implementation is to make sure, oh, the batteries died. How long have the batteries been dead for? Well, Reggie, that'll be unfortunate. Rather unfortunate. So the reason to not have sort of a base implementation that compares all the answers is you don't necessarily know in all of your subclasses for each one of these quiz answers how they're going to determine a given set of answers are correct. You could allow for sort of a fuzzy answer in some cases. So for instance, in a lot of trivia contests you might do, you might get a question that says, what's a very famous French palace outside of Paris? And most people are going to misspell Versailles. Now, if you have a very sort of mean quiz question implementation, it's not going to allow for an answer that's slightly misspelled or off. And depending on the way that you're writing it, you might care that much. But a lot of quizzes won't necessarily care if something's slightly misspelled or not, but you want to make sure when you define an abstract class or a base class, you're not being too far reaching with it. We know for each one of our individual classes, the radio, multi-choice, and true-false choices. We know each one of those has different requirements for what it considers to be a wrong and right answer. Well, we haven't covered. Have we covered generics? I don't think so. All right. I will not show you an implementation I was about to do because that would be awful for all of you.
What's an abstract class?
So an abstract class was mentioned on Monday. Abstract classes are classes that you cannot create instances of. They are used specifically to force implementation of your subclasses. And normally the reason you would create an abstract class is you do have some members that are not abstract, and each one of your classes will just get it. So we do know sort of the implementation we're assuming is every subclass is going to have some number of answers. It could be one answer, it could be 100 answers. But we can safely assume in our own individual classes implementation, oh, I can always just grab the first answer because I'm only going to ever allow one answer. The true-false case and then the individual radio button case. That's why there's what's called so these are abstract, which means there's no implementation in either of these methods, but any class that subclasses them must implement those two methods. So the question and valid answers. Sorry, question, property, and valid answer. And they must implement them with the exact same method definition, which means it has to be public, has to be a string, and the getters and setters have to have the same access modifier. So in this case, it is the standard public access modifier. Hasn't been changed from the default. Same for our valid answers. We're going to assume when you want to check to see if someone has given valid answers, they're going to pass in a list of quiz answers, and you're going to return whether or not those answers are correct. You might, if you didn't want to deal with multiple class inheritance here, you might actually just put an implementation inside of valid answers. I wouldn't do it, but because each one of your subclasses may want valid answers to be different, as I mentioned previously. Most important up here in the public quiz answers. That is something all of your classes will automatically get. So when you create a subclass, it will automatically have a list of quiz answers already there. If we wanted to go the extra mile, we could go and automatically initialize it to an empty set of list answers. And then each one of our subclasses that we're going to create will go and override the valid answers, so in each one will determine if the answer is valid. The other piece, we'll want to make sure is the answers that they give. We'll need, when we construct our class, make sure we're properly setting those answers. So our class constructors for each subclass might actually be different. So in the case of the true-false, we might just have the constructor take true or false. We know that's going to be the answer, and then the constructor can go and automatically set the list of answers and then go and check them inside the valid answers implementation. Same for the one where we have all the radio buttons. They'll choose which answer they want, they'll type it in, they'll choose it there. And then finally, the one where they can choose multiple, which is a large reason for having that list of answers. You might want to do the same thing in your constructor, where you have them specify a list of answers that are valid, instead of just true or false or a string, which may represent your valid answer. And I'll give an implementation of that by the end of tonight, so I'll probably just sit over there, finish translating it over. Does anyone have any questions on the class inheritance, sort of what you would build out, why you would build it out, just the reason for the studio from last week?
I don't have a question about that, but I have a question about the next assignment.
What is that question?
When will the description of it be available?
this weekend. Next assignment description will be available this weekend. Unless I've been lied to. So Studio for tonight is user sign up. It's what you expect. Very similar to what we did for the Python user sign up registration. We'll make a controller for the user. Don't cheat and just do the .NET new MVC that goes and automatically creates user sign up for you. You gotta do it the hard way first. Make your own user sign up. So you can go and create a spot where you go have a user form. It'll be very similar to almost exactly what we did in FlickList in Python, where we had the username, email address, password. We didn't have email address, I believe. That'll be one thing that is different. And one of the reasons specifically to handle this is the method signature that you will create for adding new users is going to use that model binding where it binds the user automatically, and then it will pull in the verify name from your form, which just like we did in ClickList, where you verified 2 passwords, you'll verify the username, the user.password with the verify right there in your controller to ensure they've given the correct matching password between the two. And then don't worry about saving the user up anywhere. The main goal for this one is making sure you have an idea of how to handle validation of data coming in. If you do want to do the bonus, you are welcome to handle it. I would say you need to, but if you really want to, feel free to do it. And remember that Tom is your instructor on Monday. So you get super excited. You get to hear someone else's voice. Maybe you'll be less bored. Are there any questions about the studio before we stand and break? I'm happy to answer that as we wander around. All right, everyone can stand and switch. There shouldn't be baggers. It's my work. They're all out. Shout back up the batteries in there. These two die. All right. Yeah, I wonder when the microphone is almost yeah, I know.
For you to figure that out, everyone would have been paying attention.
Wow.